Another term that is used frequently is encephalopathy, which is a general term used for any diffuse disease of the brain that alters the brain function or structure. That means it is a diffuse brain disease involving the entire brain, not restricted to any particular area or segment. It refers to non-infective causes of encephalopathy also, like metabolic or hepatic encephalopathies. Then we have large number of viral agents which are responsible for causing encephalitis and encephalopathy. Majority of these causes of encephalitis are viral only. So we have herpes virus, the entire group. Many viruses belonging to this herpes group are responsible for encephalitis, like HSV1 and less commonly HSV2, cytomegalovirus, human herpes virus 6, varicella zoster virus, Epstein-Barr virus. All these viruses must have been taught to you earlier or would be covered in subsequent classes. Then we have large number of arboviruses, and you would be knowing what is the meaning of arboviruses. If not, we'll be covering briefly. So there are a lot of arboviruses which can cause encephalitis, but in India per se, Japanese encephalitis virus and less commonly, very less commonly, West Nile virus can cause encephalitis. Then rabies virus, newer viruses like Nipah and Hendra, and sometimes enterovirus and even mumps virus can cause encephalitis. Enterovirus may it includes large number of viruses like the enterovirus and polio virus, then echovirus, Coxsackie virus. All of them are placed under the group enterovirus, and we'll be discussing in detail about the polio virus. Then encephalopathy can be caused by prions, and some other viruses which are known as slow viruses. Okay, so long-term sequelae of diseases like measles, rubella can also lead to encephalopathy or encephalitis-like conditions. All right. So clinically, a patient of encephalitis presents with altered consciousness with confusion and depressed level of consciousness ranging from mild lethargy even leading to coma. There can be epileptic attacks and neuropsychiatric behaviors in form of hallucinations, personality changes, or even psychotic changes can be there. And in addition to these, there can be even neurological signs which can be focal or diffuse, such as aphasia, ataxia, motor neuron weaknesses, some involuntary movements like jerks or tremors, deficiencies or defects in the cranial nerves, and sometimes if meninges are also involved, then we can see rigidity of the neck and Kernigh's and Brudzinski sign like that we talked earlier also. For laboratory diagnosis of encephalitis, the CSF profile in case of viral encephalitis would be indistinguishable from that of the viral meningitis, because in many cases meninges may also be involved. So CSF picture may reveal lymphocytic pleocytosis, that means increased lymphocytes than what is normal for a normal CSF, mildly elevated proteins, and glucose level would be normal in CSF analysis. Treatment, we don't have any specific treatment for most of the viral encephalitis. The management is mostly symptomatic and supportive. For some diseases like HSV encephalitis, we have some antiviral drugs like acyclovir, and other antiviral drugs like ganciclovir, Posarnet, cidofovir may be used alone or in combination for other causes of encephalitis like the CMV. So coming to individual viruses which can cause encephalitis, talking about arboviruses or the arthropod-borne viruses. So this, as you know, basically it is a short form for arthropod viruses, and these viruses are transmitted by arthropods or the hematophagous insect vectors, which basically feed on blood of the hosts, either humans or animals. So these viruses multiply in the tissues of arthropods and are passed on to new vertebrates by the bite of arthropod after a period of extrinsic incubation. Extrinsic incubation period is the period taken by the virus after infecting an arthropod. So it is basically the time taken by the arthropod or the vector to become infective for a new host after getting infected. That is known as extrinsic incubation period. So this group is actually taxonomically incorrect because it includes many viruses belonging to almost all or many viral families, which are not linked to each other in evolution manner, in evolutionary manner, but they are grouped on the basis of ecological and epidemiological similarities, but they are dissimilar in other properties like the shape or nucleic acid content or their behavior. Those things are different, but they are grouped together based on their ecological and epidemiological similarities only. So these are the arthropod vectors which are frequently responsible for transmission of arboviruses. They are Aedes mosquito, Anopheles mosquito, Culex, sandfly, and even ticks like hard tick and soft tick. So difference between hard tick and soft tick is that the hard tick has a hard shell on the dorsum, whereas soft tick is basically soft on the top. And the hard tick, you can appreciate presence of the head parts, the capitulum, it is visible, it is protruding, whereas in case of soft tick, it is under the dorsum of the tick. So it is covered by the dorsum in case of soft tick. So epidemiologically, the arboviruses are zoonotic infections. Most of them are zoonotic infections with few exceptions. So the cycle of the virus is maintained between some animal and insect, and human beings are mostly accidental hosts or dead-end hosts. So example of such cycles are Japanese encephalitis, yellow fever, eastern and western equine encephalitis. So the reservoir is an animal, and these animals are mostly asymptomatic, and the virus is maintained between the arthropod vector and the animal, and human being becomes infected incidentally when he or she is bitten by the arthropod carrying the virus. So these are the animal reservoirs and some of the diseases, some of the arboviral diseases for which these animals are reservoirs. Then second type of cycle is man-arthropod-man cycle. In this, there is no animal involved, and the virus is maintained between human beings and a mosquito or some other arthropod. But in this case, basically human beings are the only host for the virus. Examples include dengue and O Nyong disease, in which the virus is mostly maintained between human beings and domestic mosquitoes, mainly in the urban cycle. In jungle or sylvatic cycle, sometimes in dengue, involvement of animals can be seen. Then we also have tick-borne infections, and in case of tick-borne infections, the virus may be maintained by transoviral transmission for extended period of time. That means from mother tick, which lays egg, and the baby tick that is born would be carrying the same virus without getting exposed to an infected host. So that is transoviral transmission. And very rarely arboviral infections can be transmitted by ingestion of cow or goat milk or inhalation of aerosols or contact with infected secretions and blood. So these arboviruses can cause many diseases, including encephalitis, febrile illnesses with or without rash and arthralgia, hemorrhagic fevers, and yellow fever. So other things would have been discussed with you already, or maybe they will be discussed later. But in this lecture, we'll be concentrating ourselves with the arboviruses that are able to cause encephalitis. So this is the entire list of the important arboviruses which can cause encephalitis in human beings. So they are placed in three main families. One is Togaviridae, Flaviviridae or flavivirus, and Bunia virus. So in Togaviridae, there is alpha virus group, which includes equine encephalitis viruses, mainly the Eastern equine, Western equine, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis viruses, which are transmitted by mosquitoes. And then we have flavivirus, in which we have St. Louis encephalitis, Japanese encephalitis, West Nile encephalitis, Murray Valley encephalitis, which are all transmitted by various mosquitoes. And we have tick-borne encephalitis, like RSSE complex, looping ill, Powassan, all of them are transmitted by various ticks. And in Bunia virus, we have California encephalitis virus transmitted by some mosquito that we'll be seeing later. So these are the various arboviral encephalitis causing viruses. So coming quickly to Toga virus. So these are spherical enveloped virus. Toga itself means a cloak, which refers to basically the viral envelope. They are basically single-stranded RNA viruses, and they include alpha virus and ruby virus. Okay? So alpha virus are the ones which are basically arboviruses responsible for causing encephalitis and febrile illnesses. So the list that I showed you, this list basically includes only the arboviruses which are causing encephalitis. Similar lists are there for viruses which cause hemorrhagic fever or which cause the febrile illnesses. All right, so I'm just discussing about the encephalitis. So Toga virus or the alpha virus includes Eastern, Western, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis. So as the name suggests, they are basically agents of encephalitis in horses, and humans are sometimes infected. So Eastern, Western, and Venezuelan basically refers to the geographical area where they are more commonly distributed. So Eastern is distributed along the Eastern Canada, USA, and Caribbean. Western equine is distributed more widely in Americas, causing wide or large epidemics. And Venezuelan is prevalent mainly in the Central and South America. So they are transmitted by Culex and Anopheles mosquitoes, and wild birds can serve as reservoirs for this disease. Okay. So that was about the Toga virus, not found in India. Coming to Flaviviridae. Flaviviridae contains only one species, that is flavivirus. Flavi basically refers to yellow, referring to yellow fever, which is an important member of this Flaviviridae. Then single-stranded RNA viruses. There are more than 60 arthropod arthropod-borne viruses belonging to this group, and they are classified into two large groups. One is the mosquito-borne, and second is the tick-borne, depending upon which arthropod is responsible for their transmission. Mosquito-borne, maybe there are tick-borne. Mosquito may be responsible for causing encephalitis, yellow fever, dengue, and tick-borne viruses can also cause encephalitis or tick-borne hemorrhagic fevers. So again, we'll be talking only about encephalitis. So we have St. Louis encephalitis virus, Elias virus, and Murray Valley encephalitis virus. So all of them are not found in India. Mostly they are confined to North and Central America, or South and Central America, and Australia and New Guinea. They are transmitted by Culex mosquito. So it is important for you to remember the names and the vectors for these diseases and their area of distribution. Okay, but they are not found in India. So the next disease, that is the West Nile fever or West Nile encephalitis, is prevalent in India, and hence it is important for your examination point of view. So West Nile virus was first isolated from a febrile human being in West Nile district of Uganda, and it has since been reported from many countries, including Africa, Israel, Cyprus, France, and also from India and Pakistan. It is prevalent in India. And infection usually presents with mild, non-fatal dengue-like illness in human beings. Not all patients present with encephalitis, but it can sometimes progress to encephalitis. So the vector is mainly Culex mosquito, and the virus is maintained in nature in wild birds. So wild birds can act as reservoir hosts. And principal vector is again Culex. So diagnosis of this disease is possible mainly using various antibody ELISAs. So you can use IgM antibody capture ELISA, which detects IgM antibodies in the serum and CSF. Okay, so IgM antibodies can be useful because they tend to represent early or recent infection, and IgG ELISA can also be done in serial specimen, and you try to detect rise in titer. That means increasing concentration of the specific antibodies. We can also perform RT-PCR to detect the viral RNA. All right. Now the second most important disease causing encephalitis in India is Japanese encephalitis, probably because it has huge epidemic potential and it has caused epidemics and outbreaks in India in recent past, and still it poses a great threat. So this disease, Japanese encephalitis, was first identified in 1871 in Japan, and at that time it was called Japanese B encephalitis or Japanese encephalitis B, to distinguish it from Japanese encephalitis A, which was prevalent at that time, also known as encephalitis lethargica or von Economorb's disease. So Japanese B encephalitis is now much more common. So Japanese encephalitis, when we are talking about, we are referring to Japanese B encephalitis only by default. All right. So by default, Japanese encephalitis is Japanese B encephalitis only. Japanese A encephalitis is no longer very prevalent. So this disease, Japanese encephalitis, it is a zoonotic disease, mainly infecting animals, and human beings are incidental hosts. So these vectors, Culex tritinorhynchus, is a rural mosquito, and it is a principal vector for this disease. And another species of Culex, Culex vishnui, is the next most common vector found in India. So these two mosquitoes, Culex tritinorhynchus and Culex vishnui, are common vectors for Japanese encephalitis. So Japanese encephalitis in India was first identified in 1955 when this virus was isolated from mosquitoes in Vellore during an outbreak of encephalitis in Tamil Nadu. And since then it has remained mostly confined to southeastern parts of India. In 1973, it caused a large outbreak in West Bengal. From thereafter, there have been periodical outbreaks in various parts of the country, but now it has spread to the northern parts of the country and to the eastern parts of the country. So now almost the entire country is under its threat, barring few states like Rajasthan and Gujarat are spared, but other than that, it has covered almost the entire country. So since 2003, there have been major upsurge of Japanese encephalitis in states like Assam, Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Karnataka, Haryana, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Uttar Pradesh, and it is causing repeated outbreaks and epidemics in various parts of the country. So this is the map. The green areas are the ones which are affected by Japanese encephalitis. So some areas like Gujarat, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Jammu Kashmir are relatively spared, but other than that, almost entire country is under the radar of Japanese encephalitis. So in India, it is endemic in 15 states, and Uttar Pradesh, especially the Gorakhpur district, has the largest burden. In 2019, around 2,500 cases were reported of Japanese encephalitis with around 10% mortality. And maximum cases have also been reported from Assam. So talking about epidemiology of Japanese encephalitis, it is transmitted to human beings by the bite of mosquito, and human beings are incidental dead hosts. So basically, the cycle is maintained between pig, mosquitoes, and pig, and another cycle is maintained between the aquatic birds, the R-deed birds, mosquitoes, and these birds. So these are the two cycles responsible for maintaining Japanese encephalitis virus. So pigs, they are basically believed to be acting as amplifiers for the virus, which amplify or lead to increase in the number of viruses in the community or in the wildlife. And the birds, they act as reservoirs. So natural infection has been demonstrated in dead birds, which includes herons and egrets, and sometimes birds like ducks, pigeons, and sparrows may also be involved. So these are the two cycles, and if you look at this photograph, you can appreciate the one cycle is maintained in birds, that is known as bird and zootic cycle. So between Culex mosquito and the birds, and another cycle is maintained between pigs and Culex mosquito, and sometimes these mosquito can bite a different host. So these two cycles can merge, and the same Culex mosquito that is biting pigs or sometimes cattle can sometimes bite human beings, resulting in transmission of infection to human beings. So this is the life cycle of Japanese encephalitis virus, basically being maintained between birds and mosquito, pigs and mosquito, and human beings acting as incidental hosts. So incubation period is 5 to 15 days, and large majority of the cases are asymptomatic. So out of around 1,000 subclinical cases, only one patient would present with significant encephalitis-like features. So the clinical course can be divided into 3 stages. First is the prodromal stage, in which the patient has fever, headache, and malaise. Second is the acute encephalitis-like stage, patient developing fever, nuchal or neck rigidity, focal CNS signs, convulsions, altered sensorium, and coma. And late stage, in which if the patient heals, we can see neurological deficits, residual neurological deficits, and the case fatality is also very high. Around 20 to 40% of the patients developing clinical symptoms, they die due to this disease. So for diagnosing Japanese encephalitis, we have IgM capture ELISA. So it is a 2-step sandwich ELISA that uses Japanese encephalitis recombinant. And so I hope you know the meaning of IgM capture ELISA, which must have been taught to you previously. Also, a reverse transcriptase PCR test can be done to look for the EG. Then we do have vaccination for Japanese encephalitis, and considering the extent of disease in Indian situation, one of these vaccines has also been included in the immunization program in high prevalence districts in India. So one of the first vaccine to be developed was formalin inactivated mouse brain vaccine. So it used basically a strain that was known as Nakayama strain. So it was cultured in mouse brain, and it was inactivated with formalin. But it did not give very good results, and it also had some side effects. Another form of inactivated vaccine is there, which is grown in Vero cell line rather than mouse brain. It is grown in Vero cell line. It's manufactured in many countries in West and in India also. It requires 2 doses. But the one which is most commonly used in India is a live attenuated vaccine. So by live attenuated, we mean a vaccine which is containing virus that is weak or attenuated. so that it is not able to cause disease in human beings, but it still has antigens to which the immune system can mount response. So the strain that is used is the Japanese encephalitis strain, JE strain SA 14 14 2. You must remember this name, SA 14 14 2. So it was introduced in the routine immunization program under the UIP, that is the Universal Immunization Program in India, in more than 230 districts of India where the disease is prevalent, in states like UP, Bihar, Assam, West Bengal, Karnataka. So under the schedule, there are 2 doses. First dose is given at 9 months, 9 to 12 months of age, and second one is given at 16 to 24 months, and it is given subcutaneously. So this is a very important vaccine, and recently it has already been included in the National Immunization Program. Then briefly about tick-borne encephalitis, also a part of flaviviruses. So RSSE, or the Russian spring summer encephalitis, is transmitted by the bite of exotic ticks, which are a type of hard ticks. Not seen in India, more common in Scotland, in areas from Scotland to Siberia. Then another group is Guinea viruses, which is the largest group of arboviruses, but they are not really causing a lot of encephalitis, so we'll not be discussing about them in detail. So they basically contain 4 genus or 4 genera: Guinea virus, Glebovirus, Nairovirus, and Hantavirus. Out of them, California encephalitis virus group is there, which causes encephalitis, and another virus is responsible for aseptic meningitis. But again, very rarely they are causing infection in human beings, and from India, none have been reported. Now, Nipah and Hendra are encephalitis causing viruses which have been very recently observed or seen. So they are considered to be emerging infections. That means newer infections that are recently emerging. So Nipah virus, short form is NIV, and Hendra virus are newly emerging zoonoses. So these are zoonotic diseases. They belong to paramyxovirus, which also includes parainfluenza, measles, mumps. So they are belonging to that family of paramyxoviruses, Nipah and Hendra. And natural host of these viruses are fruit bats. So Nipah virus was first identified in 1998 in Malaysia during an outbreak. So it's around 30 years old only. And Hendra was similarly isolated in 1994 from Australia. In 2004, Nipah caused another outbreak in Bangladesh, and at that time it was found out that probably infection to human beings was transmitted as a result of consumption of date palm sap that had been contaminated with fruit bats, the saliva or secretions of fruit bats that had also fed on these date palms. So human to human transmission for these viruses is rare, although it has been documented. In India, West Bengal in 2001 and 2007, where around 50 deaths were reported, and in Kerala very recently, you must be remembering, I don't know, in 2018, outbreak of Nipah virus was there in Kerala also, very recently in 2018, where few people had expired. So Hendra virus, basically it involves horses, whereas Nipah virus causes natural infection in the pigs, but their origin is probably from bats. So Hendra virus is transmitted by exposure to infected body fluids and secretions of horses, and Nipah virus is as a result of direct contact with fruit bats, pigs, or persons, and consumption of fruit or fruit products such as date palm juice contaminated with urine or saliva of the infected fruit bat can also result in transmission of infection to human beings. Human to human transmission has also been reported, especially in close contacts. And clinical features of these viruses, Nipah and Hendra, are almost similar. They are basically causing fever, headache, sore throat, vomiting, and general infections which are associated with routine viral infections. But encephalitis leading to mental confusion and dizziness is also frequently seen. There is no vaccine for human or animals, but a new vaccine has been developed recently that I'll be showing. Treatment is basically just a minute, please. All right. So, primary treatment for human cases is routine intensive supportive care. There is no specific antiviral treatment. For lab diagnosis, again PCR and IgG or IgM ELISA. No specific antiviral drug is there, but we have a vaccine, a subunit vaccine developed using Hendra G protein, which protects against both Hendra and Nipah viruses. So this vaccine has been used in Australia to protect horses against Hendra virus, and it can be used in human beings also, but not. It is not basically used for routine immunization, but only in close contacts or in case of outbreaks in localized areas. So coming to the Trichorna family, which includes the enterovirus, which includes the poliovirus. So we'll be discussing poliovirus in detail because it is a very important virus and it used to cause a severe disease, but now it has been largely eradicated from the world, including India, barring few countries. So we must know in detail about poliovirus because the threat still looms around. It is not yet completely eradicated from the world. So we are still on high alert as far as polio is considered. So this family, Trichorna viridae, it includes various viruses like enterovirus, rhinovirus, hepatovirus, varicovirus, aphthovirus, cardiovirus. But we'll be discussing about enterovirus, and that too in enterovirus we'll be talking about polioviruses. So poliovirus is, as you know, responsible for a disease known as poliomyelitis. So it is not basically directly encephalitis causing disease. Encephalitis may occur in some conditions, but it is more of a in initial cases it causes aseptic meningitis, and it sometimes in later cases it causes myelitis, which is basically involvement of the spinal cord or nerves. So in poliomyelitis, it is an acute infectious disease with high affinity for the nervous tissue, and it specifically targets mainly the motor neuron, resulting in flaccid paralysis. So this virus is a single-stranded positive sense RNA virus, relatively very small, 28 nanometers only. It is a non-enveloped virus, icosahedral symmetry with 60 capsomeres. It has 4 proteins. BP1, which faces the outside, is a major antigenic site used for neutralization test and for identification of the virus. So antigenically speaking, there are 3 types of polioviruses, 3 types of wild polioviruses based on neutralization test, which detect various antigens on the surface of the virus. So type 1, type 2, and type 3, also known as wild poliovirus, WPV1, 2, 3. Okay, so type 1 is the most common, responsible for epidemics. Type 2 is usually endemic, and type 3 again causes epidemics. So there are various types of antigens. D or C antigens are there. Okay. Then it is easily inactivated by high temperature at 55 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes. But it is resistant to ether, chloroform, and other organic compounds, being non-enveloped virus. Naturally, infections are seen only in human beings. Experimentally, it can be it can infect monkeys and chimpanzees, and various cell lines and tissue cultures of human or primate origin are used for culturing this virus. So epidemiologically speaking, it used to occur in sporadic, endemic, or epidemic forms. All three types used to cause infection, but type 1, wild poliovirus type 1 was the most common, and currently all natural infections are caused by type 1, wild poliovirus type 1, because both type 2 and type 3 have been eradicated globally in the years 1999 and 2019 respectively. So type 2 was the first poliovirus to be eradicated, followed by type 3, and type 1 is still causing disease in few countries that we can see. So the virus is shed in feces for around 3 weeks of the cases, and up to 3 or 4 months in some. And it can be shed also in the throat secretions during early disease, and it can survive in sewage water up to 6 months. This is important because presence of virus in sewage indicates that the virus is still prevalent or still present in that particular area. Mode of infection is mainly fecal-oral, that means through consumption of dirty or contaminated water or food items. Droplet infection is less common, and human beings are the only reservoir. So pathogenesis, as I told you, key infection is through orophycal route. It is acquired through mouth, and it subsequently it reaches the intestines, from where it enters the lymphatics and gains entry into the mesenteric lymph nodes and the cervical lymph nodes, from where it enters from where it causes primary viremia and subsequently causes secondary viremia, which leads to spread of infection to the parts of CNS, mainly involving the spinal cord. And in spinal cord, it mainly involves the anterior or the ventral horns. Later on, dorsal horns may be involved, but at least initially, it has predilection for the ventral horns, which are the motor neurons. In CNS, it multiplies in the neurons and destroys them. The earliest change seen in the spinal cord are the degeneration of Nissl bodies, and the lesions are mostly present in the anterior horns of spinal cord. So clinical features of poliomyelitis is like a tip of the iceberg. Why? Because for every 500 or 1000 infections, we see that most of them are subclinical, and this is important in polio because these subclinical cases can serve to spread the infection in the community. So it is very difficult to identify the people who are infected at subclinical level, who are not showing any symptom, but they are still responsible for spreading infection in the community. So that is why identification of even one clinical case means that there are several thousands of cases in the community which are active. So in most of the cases, it is subclinical or inapparent, and virus may be isolated from throat or feces. Second phase, or slightly more severe, is the abortive poliomyelitis, in which there are few symptoms that disappear on their own, and there are no paralysis or weakness. The infection is mainly presenting as mild illness, mild influenza-like illness, like fever, malaise, nausea, vomiting, constipation, mild sore throat, and the patient recovers within few days. Then, still fewer cases, we can have aseptic meningitis, and this is known as non-paralytic poliomyelitis. So basically, poliomyelitis is beginning to involve the CNS, but there are no paralytic symptoms, and recovery is mostly rapid and complete, but some cases may progress to the next stage, which is the paralytic poliomyelitis. So one case of paralytic polio is seen for every 100 to 1000 subclinical cases of polio, and this type of paralysis is descending, asymmetric, flaccid paralysis. Okay, there is no spasm, there is no spastic paralysis, there is a flaccid paralysis because of lower motor neuron damage. And so these are some of the common muscles which are weakened by polio. And in earlier days and even today, we see few patients who are suffering from polio with various kinds of deformities in the extremities, and these are mainly because of the weakness of the muscles. So it basically involves the muscles around the hip joint, around the knee joint, and the foot joint. So these muscles are basically developing into contractures that cause tight cords, and there is the unopposed muscle pull from the other group of muscle. For example, if the flexor muscle is weakened, then unopposed pull from the extensor group of muscles would lead to deformity in polio. And also there is gravity pull and defective posture, which all leads to development of deformities that we see in polio patients. So muscles around hip, knee, and foot, shoulder muscles, arm muscles, thumb muscles are the various group of muscles which are commonly weakened by polio virus. Pregnancy, tonsillectomy, intramuscular injections, or severe muscular exertion or trauma can increase the risk of paralysis. So these are some of the photos of patients who are suffering from poliomyelitis to various degrees. Then another thing is post-polio syndrome, which is basically seen in patients who have recovered from polio, and up to around 15 or 20 years later, they begin to develop progressive muscular weakness, gradual and progressive muscular weakness, okay? Pain and fatigue many years after an attack of acute paralytic polio. So for laboratory diagnosis of polio, any patient who is suffering from acute flaccid paralysis has to be tested for polio. Okay? Because as we will see in subsequent slides, there is an index known as acute flaccid paralysis index that we'll see later. So for lab diagnosis of polio, the typical sample that is collected is fecal sample, because it is a enterovirus which is excreted in feces. So 2 samples are collected within 14 days of onset of illness, and chances of isolation of virus are 80% in first week, 50% in up to third week, and thereafter 25%. We can also collect rectal swabs, pharyngeal swabs of pharyngeal washes, and blood during primary viremia. Post-mortem samples can be collected, but the virus is not generally present in the CSF. So directly from these samples, the virus can be demonstrated by electron microscopy, but more commonly, as the WHO recommends, the viral diagnosis has to be done by culture. So this is one of the rare diseases in which the primary mode of diagnosis of any viral illness is by viral culture. The reason being that we need, since poliovirus is the virus which has been on the verge of eradication, we now need to know which virus is circulating in the community. Hence, just diagnosing polio is not the aim. We wish to isolate the virus and to study it further. Okay? So that is why virus isolation is one of the key things that is done for diagnosis of polio. So the stool sample is mixed in saline containing antibiotics ether and centrifuged to destroy various bacteria and fungi. And clear supernatant is inoculated into various cell lines. Commonly used cell lines are the primary monkey kidney cell lines, RD or human rhabdomyosarcoma cell lines, and L20B cell lines. So cytopathogenic effects can be seen after 3 to 6 days. So what are the cytopathogenic effects? Cytopathogenic effects are basically various changes that a particular virus induces in the cell line when it is growing in them. So by CPE that are produced by poliovirus include cellular disorganization, including separation, swelling, and increased refractivity of the cells and lysis. Basically, it completely obliterates or destroys or crenates the cell lines. Subsequently, whether it is wild polio 1, 2, or 3 can be identified using neutralization test with specific antiserum. So these are the cytopathic effects. On the left side, you can see is the normal or the native vero cell line, and on the right side, the vero cell line has been destroyed by the virus. So serology is also can be helpful, particularly if the patient is known to be not vaccinated, because if the person is vaccinated, then he or she would be having some antibodies. And other than that, PCR is also available, but primarily any suspected patient, we do attempt culture. Immunity, IgM is recent type of antibody, so it appears early. IgG persists lifelong. But more importantly, IgA antibody, which is present in the GI tract, it provides mucosal immunity, prevents intestinal infection and shedding. So for prevention of poliomyelitis, we have few antibodies, few vaccines. Two very important vaccines are the inactivated polio vaccine, that is the IPV, and second is the OPV, that is the oral polio vaccine. All right. So inactivated polio vaccine is known as Salk vaccine because it was named after this scientist. So this vaccine basically, as the name suggests, inactivated. So it is containing killed or formalized virus. So the virus, this strain is grown in monkey kidney tissue culture, and it is inactivated using formalin. It is given by intramuscular dose, and it can also be given by intradermal dose in lesser dose, that is known as fractional IPV. It is given in a fractional dose. So it induces IgM, IgG, and IgA, but there is no local immunity. IgA is present only in serum because the virus has not come in contact with the gut. So there is no local immunity. Hence, it doesn't prevent infection by the virus in the gut. There is, it protects against the disease, but not against infection. There is no herd immunity, which is seen in the oral polio vaccine. It is not useful in epidemics, but advantage is that it has got longer shelf life. However, it is expensive as compared to the OPV. It is safer for immunodeficient patients and pregnant females and patients on steroid and chemotherapy because it contains killed virus. Okay, OPV contains live virus, so it may pose some threat to immunocompromised patients. So this is the normal dosage for IPV given intramuscularly. 0.5 ml is given, and for dose which is given intradermally, 0.1 ml is given. So this is known as fractional IPV, FIPV. Okay. Then the second vaccine is the oral polio vaccine or the Sabin vaccine. So it contains the live attenuated virus grown in monkey kidney cell line or human diploid cell lines. Normally it is given in 3 doses, 6, 10, 14, with booster dose given at 12 to 18 months. But under the Pulse Polio program, all children under the age of 5 years are repeatedly given doses. It simulates natural infection because it is an oral vaccine. So it simulates natural infection, and hence it leads to both humoral, that is IgG IgM immunity, as well as intestinal immunity in the intestinal tract. Hence it prevents disease and infection by the wild polio virus. It can be useful for controlling epidemics, and it also gives rise to herd immunity because this polio virus can spread in the community and can help in immunizing and providing immunity in the community. And also, since it prevents against infection also, in contrast to IPV, which is not protecting against infection, it tends to provide some sort of immunity to the community also. So important is proper temperature should be maintained. It can be stored at minus 20 degrees for 2 years and at 4 to 8 degrees Celsius for 4 months. Hence, maintaining cold chain is very important for oral polio vaccine. So the strain that is used for oral polio vaccine, we have to be very careful that it doesn't cause disease or it doesn't have the potential to get transformed into a disease-causing virus. So these are some features of the attenuated strain. The virus should not be neurovirulent. It should be able to set up intestinal infection and induce antibody response. It should not acquire virulence after serial enteric passages. That means after infecting multiple hosts, after passing out from the feces, it should not turn neurovirulent, and it should possess certain genetic markers so that if you are isolating this virus from any source in the community, then we should be able to distinguish whether this is a wild virus or this is a vaccine virus. So OPV, the vaccine that was earlier used was trivalent. It had types 1, 2, and 3. Then since type 2 was causing very few infections and later on it was eradicated, they switched to type 1 and 3, that is the bivalent. This vaccine is not safe for immunodeficient patients and for pregnant and patients on steroids because it contains live virus. Alright, so these are some of the differences between IPV and OPV. IPV, it is killed, OPV is live. IPV is safer, but there was an incident in which vaccine was given containing inadequately killed virus, which led to few cases of polio. OPV is not safe in immunodeficient. It can lead to vaccine-associated paralytic polio. Immunity, IPV is only systemic. OPV provides both local, intestinal, and systemic, and it also gives rise to herd immunity. Both are equally good. OPV is more lasting. OPV provides community protection and it is useful in epidemics. OPV is cheaper, but it requires strict cold chain for transport. Eradication of polio is possible and is being attempted because man is the only host for diseases in which the animals are also the host, or the agent can be found in soil or in water or everywhere else with unlimited lifespan. it becomes very difficult for eradication. But polio is a virus which is primarily a human disease, and it can survive in sewage only up to 5 or 6 months. Hence, it is possible that we can eradicate this disease. There are no long-term carrier stage. Even if a patient has developed paralytic polio, that means lifelong deformity is there, but still polio virus is not there. Half-life of virus in sewage is only 48 hours. Maximum survival is up to 6 months. And mass immunization campaigns using OPV on the same day disrupts the transmission of the wild polio virus. So these are some of the factors which have helped us in eradicating the virus. So some of the strategies that were adopted for eradication include routine immunization as part of universal immunization schedule, in which each child received at least 3 doses of trivalent OPV. Then mass immunization by use of pulse polio immunization, in which all children under 5 years of age are repeatedly vaccinated. Then surveillance of acute flaccid paralysis. There are a number of causes for acute flaccid paralysis in children, and there is a fixed percentage at least these many patients of acute flaccid paralysis should be evaluated for polio. That means their stool sample should be submitted within 48 hours of the onset for evaluation of polio virus. Okay. And then mopping up immunization, which means in areas where there is increased transmission, the transmission is not going down, mop up immunization is done, in which house to house campaigns are conducted to find unimmunized children and conduct immunization. So these were the strategies that were practiced earlier that led to successful eradication of polio virus from India. So the beginning of this program was in 1988 when WHO first introduced this initiative, and since then the number of cases have gone down by 99% from an estimated 3,03,000 to 160 cases in 2020. Maximum cases were seen in India from Delhi, Bihar, and UP, West Bengal. In India, Pulse Polio program was initiated in 1994, and last polio case in India was reported around 10 years back in Howrah district in West Bengal on 13th January 2011, and the country has been free of polio since then. In 2014, India received polio-free certification along with the entire Southeast Asian country region. So India is now technically free from polio, or polio has been eradicated, but still we have to be on our toes because our neighboring countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan are still reporting polio. So it is possible that polio may be re-imported into India from these countries. So endemic transmission is still continuing in mainly Afghanistan, Nigeria and Pakistan, and recently I think Nigeria has also been reported to be not endemic anymore. So Afghanistan and Pakistan are the only countries, and failure to stop polio in these countries may result in large number of cases if the virus again begins to spread. So international importation of wild polio virus and subsequent spread is a major threat or major challenge for the countries that have eradicated polio in their own countries. Then another threat is VAP, which is vaccine associated paralytic polio, in which the OPV that is being used containing live attenuated vaccine can sometimes change a little bit and cause paralytic polio in the vaccinees or in their close contacts who have been exposed to this virus. But it is not capable of causing outbreaks since change is only minor and it affects only one particular person. Another threat is vaccine-derived poliovirus, in which there is a higher level of genetic divergence of the OPV strain. That means the virus in the OPV vaccine changes a lot and it becomes capable of causing disease again. So 3 types of VDPV are seen: circulating, which is capable of spreading from person to person in the community, and this type most commonly caused by type 2, and hence there was a switch from trivalent to bivalent OPV, removing type 2 from the OPV. Then another type is immunodeficiency associated VDPV, which is seen in patients with immunodeficiency who have received OPV, and ambiguous from unknown source. So circulating VDPV are the ones which are circulating in the community and spread from person to person by fecal-oral transmission, and they can cause outbreaks, and they pose the same threat to the community as wild polio virus. So these are some of the areas where circulating vaccine-derived polio outbreaks have been seen. And the way forward with polio eradication is that we have to maintain immunity till global eradication is achieved. So that is why you are seeing that polio campaigns or pulse polio programs are still being maintained in India, because we have to keep immunity high to prevent importation of polio virus from neighboring countries. Detection and responding to importations and outbreaks is important, and immunization of travelers and surveillance and laboratory support is also important. Then these are some of the strategies for next 5 years that have been put up to contain polio. All right. So that is about the encephalitis and polio virus. So any questions? All right, thank you.